Today, we're going to pivot and speak specifically about risk mitigation. So, we'll start with the basics. When we're thinking about risk mitigation, you have to understand that it is one of the most important one of the most important elements of cybersecurity and risk overall, because as a reminder, risk management is about finding the threats and vulnerabilities that can harm your organization or potentially put harm to people. In case in point is the T app itself. In this T app, there was very private information that was exposed that could put those people into identity theft or privacy issues, anything like that. And so they're in deep water because of that. So risk management and risk mitigation is really important for that specific item. Now, risk mitigation is specifically focused on either controlling, minimizing, or essentially eliminating any elements that could increase the likelihood and impact of that risk. The entire goal here is the protection of assets to make sure that the organization is still able to operate as usual and to protect individuals. Now, protecting individuals is, of course, talking about human life, but also we're talking about negative consequences. We're trying to protect individuals from having their identity stolen or from any issues there within. So we'll go through that here in a second. But there are four specific strategies to mitigate risk. So the first one is accepting it, and we'll address these in depth later on. Then the other one is avoiding it, so it's kind of like taking it out completely. Transferring it means shifting it to a third party. In this case, we'll mainly focus on insurance. And then reduction. So making sure to reduce the likelihood and impact of that risk specifically happening. Reduction and acceptance are kind of on the same scale. We'll break down the differences here in a bit. Now, as we're going through this, we're essentially going to use our Let's Go company. So this one here, and it's our travel company, right? It's our fictional travel company. So we're going to look at some of the financial risks, some of the regulatory risks, as well as some of the cybersecurity risks that are associated with risk mitigation. So the things that we're going to go through in this class are understanding the differences between these four mitigation strategies, because risk mitigation is going to play a part in your career, whether you're working as a pen tester, whether you're on blue team, whether you're working in privacy or in GRC. There's going to be risk mitigation and risk management in every single role. So understanding the difference between these four and how exactly to implement it is going to be really, really important. All right. So let's talk in depth. When we're talking about risk mitigation, a good way to describe risk mitigation is essentially a strategic approach to prepare for and reduce the impact and likelihood of threats that could affect the business. So it's essentially a looking at all of your risks that exist, and then finding out very specific strategies, in this case, the four ones that we had mentioned, to reduce any possibility of it having a negative effect on the business. That's the primary point. Now, in cybersecurity, if you don't have proper risk management, well, then, like I mentioned, it could create breaches. You could have several incidences. You could have reputational loss. You could have major financial loss. The T app right now is getting sued for millions and millions and millions of dollars. Their legal team is probably putting all-nighters. And so this could have been avoided if they had had the right risk mitigation steps. Now, there are different types of risks that we have to take into account. So, of course, there are technical ones since we're thinking about cybersecurity, but there are also human risks such as insider threats or phishing. There's also operational risks. What I mean by that is if you're bringing in a new software that hasn't been vetted, that doesn't have all the right security controls, that could add a risk to your organization. And then there's a regulatory risk. These are all different examples of risks that can exist for an organization, but it's not just one. Multiple different of these risks exist. Keep in mind, risk does not have to be just at the cybersecurity level. It can be all across the entire organization. It cannot just be IT either. It can be any sort of people. It can be physical security. There are a bunch of different layers of it. Now, here are a couple examples. Now, the first one is internal accountability. So, internal accountability is essentially looking internally at your team and thinking, okay, what exactly do we need to do for our team to understand what these risks are? AKA educating your team. This is where cybersecurity awareness and training comes into play. Because when you educate your employees to say, hey, anytime you're accessing a website, make sure that it is a secure connection. Make sure that's HTTPS and not HTTP. Second thing is if your employees don't know how to spot a phishing email, well, then you need to train them as such. You need to make sure that they understand strong passwords. You need to make sure that they understand how to report suspicious activity. Now, in terms of the reporting process, this is your responsibility as an organization to make reporting as simple and easy as possible. You do not want to make reporting a really huge, sophisticated process where people have to email this and do that. It just should just be one step. Ideally, even just one button with two places to input text, because then it's very simple and then it creates an alert and it's handled a lot easier. This is why having clear procedures is really important and socializing those procedures to the external team is so important because then they all know what to expect and what to do, and specifically, very important, who to contact. There was an organization I worked for, and they literally brought the entire security team and the entire IT team and said, hey, we're going to say if you have any security questions, if there's an incident that you're afraid of, any one of you can answer that question. Meaning, it was our job as the IT staff, as well as security staff, to know how to answer that question, even if it meant, thank you for bringing it up. Let me get back to you. Let me get into it. Or, thanks for bringing this up. Can you please send the email to incident response at companyname.com? Those are all examples of who to contact and what to do. This is important because the employees need to know how exactly to approach an incident or how exactly to approach a potential risk. In this case, you want to encourage reporting. You want to encourage them uh, to come forward with any risks or anything that they have in mind. Next one is security hardening. In very simple terms, this is just finding out the vulnerabilities that exist in your security system and then addressing them accordingly. So that means if you have a login page that's just username, password, that's all you need to get in, well, then you need to enforce MFA, multi-factor authentication. And then you want to also make sure that you're enforcing physical restrictions, such as you need a badge to enter certain rooms, or at the very least, you need a badge to enter your critical areas, such as IT servers or server racks. Next is making sure that you have patching, maybe reviewing your firewall, and then also doing UARs. UAR stands for User Access Review. This is where you look at all the permissions, who has access to what, and you validate whether they still need access or not. Typically, this is done quarterly, and it can be due to compliance standards. So security hardening is just making sure you're having all the right security steps in place. Improved alerting systems. So this is making sure that you have a system that logs all the activity and that can send alerts in real time in case any suspicious behavior was found. This is really important because this can act as like an overall monitoring, like a camera or a watchdog per se, because it helps you identify and respond to issues very, very fast, as opposed to when if it's just a human by themselves. The concept here is alerting. Alerting makes sure that you're aware of things in real time. And this is a very simple step that can be implemented in risk mitigation. And then the last one is getting outside help. Now, getting outside help is essentially asking an expert, asking a company who's really good at risk mitigation or cybersecurity to do some additional in-house work, to do some additional training, maybe even to have them install a product on your network so that you can have you can bolster up your cybersecurity team. Now, some companies, maybe like the smaller ones or startups, they may not have a full cybersecurity team yet. So it's important that it's important that you reach out for help if you don't have all the right resources. When you hire these security teams or security consultants, what that does, it essentially ticks a box, especially if you're trying to maintain regulatory standards and improve all your overall defenses, because they're going to tell you exactly what you need to fix. Having an outside perspective essentially makes sure that they're not in the situation, they're looking at it from a third person point of view, and they can pinpoint some blind spots that you may not see yourself. So you might be wondering, okay, well, we are talking about risk mitigation, but why is risk mitigation so important? So I'm going to ask you all this first. Why, in your own words, do you think risk mitigation is important? Please respond in the thread. I'll give you all a second. The question is, why, in your own words, do you think risk mitigation is important? Avoid an incident, reduce chances of a breach, says Brendan. To avoid breaches, Abdul says, Be aware and avoid. Wajiha, I like that one. There is no risk free to protect data, enable enterprise to stay safe, keep data secure. It helps George says it helps proper decision making. That is a great one. I really like that. Yep, it does help proper decision making, helps protect people and companies by being prepared for any risk that may rise. Yes. Risk mitigation keeps surprises from turning into disasters. Yes. So Richard brought up a good point. It helps keep surprise from becoming into disasters. In cybersecurity, you do not want surprises. You never want surprises. Actually, I'll even go as far as to say if you're going to work in cybersecurity or in tech, you always want to be in constant communication with your manager to avoid surprises, because the less surprises they are, the easier it is to mitigate those situations. What I always did is anytime I thought there was a risk, I would bring it up to my team lead and be like, "Hey, just so you know, I anticipate this could be a risk if we don't address it." All of you are hitting the nail on the head. So when we're talking about risk mitigation, in this case, we're talking about, again, the reduction of the need to reduce the impact of a threat and making sure to find out all the vulnerabilities so that we can mitigate them accordingly. So this is not just technical. We're looking at security, financial, we're looking at regulatory risks. All of these risks are elements that involve an impact to the organization that we're trying to reduce. So it means understanding that risks in an organization are inevitable. They are going to exist. They are going to happen. So we want to look at it very scientifically and look at the likelihood and potential harm so that we can create plans and responses to these risks before they actually become an incident. So we want to be proactive in this case. So why is this important? Because like I said, there's never a full situation where there's going to be zero risk. There's always going to be some risk. And so we need to make sure to look at all of the ones that we can control and which ones we can't, because not all of the risks are in our control. Very simple example is natural disasters, earthquakes, fires, lightning, tsunamis. Nothing we can control on that front. Another piece that we can't control partially is third-party actions. So if you have a third party that enters into your organization, let's just say, for example, we have Google come into our organization and we start using Gmail, Google Calendar, all that kind of stuff. All of a sudden, Google decides that they want to partner, they want to change their entire platform to make it open source, open to everyone, meaning that nothing is private anymore. Well, if that happens, that would be a big major risk. But we can't control what that third party does, just the same way we can't control natural disasters. If you want to put it in a more practical term, I'll say you can reduce the chances of having a car accident if, let's say, you drive more carefully or you have like security cameras, and that's you taking control of the things you can control. However, you can't control how other people drive. So if other people are driving haphazardly, that's not something you can control, even though you put all of the protection measures in place for you. The benefit is if you have a camera and if you're driving cautiously, well, then you can document when an accident happens, and then you can say, and the judge or in court, hey, I had the camera on. I was not at fault. They were at fault, making you a lot more safe. So you mitigate the risk in that sense. Now, um, so an example here with Let's Go is that maybe you have some data centers and that data center decides that, hey, we're going to put those data centers in Texas because it costs less. However, you have to look at, again, risk and reward, right? If they go into Texas, the chances of a hurricane or a tornado damaging them could be significant. And so we want to look at if cutting those costs would be enough for us to say, oh, we have a service outage because we decided to put all of our servers down, our data centers down in Texas. So looking at those consequences. Speaking of consequences, so by one of our presidents, he said, "Fool me once, shame on you. Shame on you. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, you can't get fooled again." Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again. Huh, I think that was his quote. Okay, let's carry on here. So when it comes to consequences can repeat. So the reason why I bring this up is risk events can happen multiple times. If lessons aren't learned and defenses aren't improved. Case in point. This is a very case in point of consequences can repeat. If one of your servers is insecure, you have to look at what other of your servers are insecure. In this case, this risk was pretty huge. So because of that risk, well, then they experienced a major breach. Same thing happened with T-Mobile. So T-Mobile experienced a major breach back in 2021, but they didn't do all the right security controls. So in 2023, they were breached again. So this exposed a lot of people's data. You know that there's a really good cybersecurity team in one very simple way. If they get hacked, well, then after like a month or two, they don't get hacked again. Even better, if years down the line, they don't get hacked again. Because that means that they heavily learned from their mistakes and then they implemented all of the right things to protect themselves. Now, the next one is unplanned risk. What does unplanned risk mean? So I love this quote by Winston Churchill. He who fails to plan is planning to fail. That is why I have a personal quote. My personal quote is I proactively plan and effectively execute. Trademark pending. But I always loved that because of this quote. And that means that if you're trying to if you don't have a plan when you're going to do something, well, then you're planning to fail. Having a plan makes sure that you at least have a direction where you're headed in. Okay. Without a mitigation plan in place, a lot of companies may lose a lot of time, money, and energy when they respond to a risk if it strikes. So if you have a plan on how to address these, well, then at least you'll be able to act a lot quicker. So in 2021, there was an incident where Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp had a global outage due to a security error that with no proper backup plan for engineers to fix it. I have a friend who was working at WhatsApp and was working on the privacy team, and they acknowledged it. They said, we were not prepared. We thought someone had a plan, and that person thought someone else had a plan. There was no proper communication that there was a very solid plan. I remember in 2021 when Instagram, Facebook, and all of that went down. Now, the cost of all of that was millions of dollars, because remember, time is money. In this case, availability is money. Remember, we talked about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. All of those are centered around the cybersecurity framework, and availability is where money comes in. If people can't use the platform, that means there are no eyeballs on ads. That means that they aren't gathering information, which means they're losing money. So it's important to understand that availability in this case is money, which is why having a plan in case a risk were to be exploited is incredibly important. So then you might be asking, okay, so we have a better understanding of what risk mitigation is. How exactly does that fit into the grander scheme of risk management? Well, in this instant, I would call risk mitigation one of the core pillars or one of the most important elements of um, risk management overall. Remember, risk management is the overall coordination, planning, and control of all of the risks. Risk mitigation is a piece of that. It's one of the key pillars of it. The reason why that's important is because it's choosing, with risk mitigation, you are choosing the appropriate response in each risk situation to reduce or control the threats that are going to cause a negative impact on your organization. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about threats here, right? So these threats can be anything from insider threats, such as people. It can be a technical threat, such as a potential a folder or a data server that's unsecure. It could be systems. It could be other organizations, nation states. These are all different threats that you're trying to mitigate, that you're trying to reduce. Now, the Harvard Review, they essentially say that risk management includes identifying, assessing, mitigating the threat, and evaluating how effective those actions are. So all of them play an element in it. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Brian. So risk mitigation is one of the key elements of overall risk management. So, like we said, what are some of the components of the risk management framework? We talked about this a little bit in the past. When we're talking about the risk management framework, keep in mind, this is not the end all be all. There are many different risk management frameworks that exist out there, especially like the ones that we had talked about before. But we're going to break them down into these 5 key elements. Now, when you're thinking about 5 key elements, keep in mind that we're trying to organize risk, we're trying to assess it, and then we're trying to respond to it. So obviously, the first step in the overall risk management is identification. This means that we're trying to create a catalog of all the known risks, all the known threats, and all the known system vulnerabilities that exist in the IT space. This is a first step in understanding what you're facing. So, with that being said, what is a good resource to see all the threats and system vulnerabilities? Vulnerabilities. I'm looking for a 3-letter acronym. So let's see who can get that first. This is a speed run. If you're looking for a place that has all the vulnerabilities that kind of like describes, hey, you're using this platform, these are the vulnerabilities associated with it, where would you look? CVE, Jignesh for the win. Everyone else who comments CVE, good job as well. As a reminder, a CVE stands for common vulnerability and exposure. And you can look for the index. Now, the index, the one that you can go to is the CISA website. So that's one place you can go. There's also cve.org, but this is the one that a lot of people go to because this is also what a lot of people reference. Richard, that is correct. NVD is one as well. So you can look at all the common vulnerabilities here. This is what I mean when I say that we want to identify all of the ones that currently exist, because that's the first step in the risk management framework so that we know what we can look out for in case we're using any of those tools. And then the next one is assessment. So assessment is essentially looking at, hey, we want to rank and categorize all of these risks based on three cat factors. I mainly focus on the two, which is likelihood and impact. But you also have to look at scope. So likelihood, impact, and scope are the things that you really want to use in order to give it a risk score. This helps you prioritize which risk should be addressed first. Like that risk register I sent you, and how we had the likelihood and impact being two of the elements that are most important to prioritize which risks we want to address first. And then there's mitigation. So the mitigation is essentially making sure that you have you build a library of responses that will be able to deal with risk itself. So this means that you want to either use any of the four ones that we have mentioned before. So either you avoid, transfer, reduce, or accept. Now, in this case, with the mitigation step, it's pretty vast because there could be because you can never get rid of any risk, you're always going to have a laundry list of risks. And the idea is that you're never going to be bored. If you're ever a risk manager, you're never going to run out of a job because there's always going to be another risk that you're going to need to work on. So the mitigation step means coming up with the different responses for those different risks. Reporting and monitoring just means that you're looking at whether the mitigation strategies are working as intended. You're creating a reporting structure as appropriate, and then you're updating the strategy based on any new and emerging threats. Whether this is new platform, or maybe there's a new CVE that came out about a tool that you're using, that kind of stuff. And then there's the concept of governance. As a reminder, the concept of governance is essentially focused on the people, roles, and the data associated with that specific risk. When you organize all of that in a way that makes sense, when you're creating procedures and policies around it, you're going to have a more effective risk management overall, because this makes sure that there is clarity. There's clarity in, well, when we're talking about people, who actually owns it, and what is their specific role, and then what is the data, and then it creates a very consistent process to what to do if that risk were to materialize. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit more and dig into the four different risk mitigation strategies. Now, the way I'll approach this is we're going to talk in depth about each one a little more, but I'll give you a very high level understanding of each one so that you can kind of like prime yourself for the deep dive. The first one is acceptance. Now, I will mention that acceptance is not just saying, oh, we accept it, we're done. That's not what it is. I'll explain that later. But what it is it's acknowledging that the risk exists, but you're choosing not to act on it. No, this is deliberate. This is deliberate, meaning that you're making a deliberate choice as an organization to not take any specific action against that risk. Now, the reason why you would do this is because it tends to be low likelihood and low impact. If it's low likelihood and low impact, that means that it probably won't have it probably won't be that big of an issue, right? So the effort it would take to address this risk would probably be too expensive, or it would be too much effort, more than it's actually required. In this situation, you would want to make sure you address the higher priority risk, so higher likelihood and higher impact. An example here is like with SpaceX. So SpaceX accepted like early rocket launch failures at the beginning as part of the learning process so that they could innovate and make better technology in the future. So that is an acceptance because they were trying to kind of like get better. Next one is avoidance. Now, avoidance is essentially eliminating the risk entirely. So whether you avoid the activity that caused it, maybe you're avoiding the system where you take away the system or the application in question, but it's essentially getting rid of the risk entirely. So where you'd want to apply this is it's chosen when a risk is absolutely severe or completely unmanageable, and to the point where, okay, this is such a huge risk that we need to not address it. We need to not use it anymore. An example would be if if I if I were a company and I was using a file server, and that file server all of a sudden said, "Hey, we have an admin feature where everyone can log in, and we're going to save all of your data in plain text format, meaning it's not encrypted. We don't have a mechanism to encrypt it at all. It's not within our tech stack." Then I would say, well, we're not going to use that anymore. We're getting rid of it. We're using something else. That would be an example of avoidance. Another example in this case is Apple avoids risk by essentially minimizing user data storage. So that means they have their system set up in such a way that they limit how much data is exposed so that they don't have privacy breaches. They don't have as many privacy breaches. So um, there's a term that I'm blanking on right now, but the term is essentially a way to say, hey, this is how much data we can store versus not store, that kind of stuff. Then there is transference. So transference is essentially when you're shifting the responsibility or you're shifting the impact of the risk to a third party outside of the organization. So that means that if that risk were to materialize or become an actual incident, well, then the brunt and the impact would not hit the actual organization or the company. It would transfer to someone else. Now, in this case, the most common situation is insurance, or maybe you're outsourcing or your contracts. I'll dig deep into what that looks like because there are subcontractors and whatnot, and so you'll see what I mean. An example of that is essentially Target when they transferred their financial risk from their breach back in 2023, and they were using cybersecurity insurance to essentially cover the legal and settlement costs. Because they had insurance, well, then that financial cost and that financial burden of that breach actually goes to the insurance as opposed to Target taking on that brunt end. And the last one is reduction. So with reduction, I said at the beginning of class that reduction is similar to acceptance because you're essentially accepting that it exists, but you're taking action to reduce either the likelihood or the impact of the risk. In this case, you could sometimes either reduce both, but with reduction, it's kind of like a middle ground. If you were to kind of like label them, in order to fully get rid of the risk, it would be avoidance. And then if you were to say, okay, well, the risk exists, but we don't want to be fully impacted, it would be transference. And then after that, you say, okay, there's a risk, we're going to accept it, but we do want to reduce the likelihood or the impact, it would be reduction. And then acceptance is, okay, the risk exists, but we're not going to take any action on it. Because reduction would be essentially used if you're wanting to say, okay, we have this risk but we can reduce the risk if we apply access control. We reduce the risk if we have specific backups on this specific system. And then if you just like reduce or manage the risk exposure, that would essentially be a reduction strategy. So Google has a reduction strategy where it reduces their cybersecurity risk overall by using things such as encryption. When you're using encryption, you're reducing the impact. If your data were to be stolen, well, it's still encrypted. They can't do anything about it. Another one is regular updates so that they have the most up-to-date patches. And then they do a lot of vulnerability testing to make sure that they are staying up to date. Not just that, but Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, they all have these really, really great bug bounty programs. So if you're unfamiliar, there are things called bug bounty programs, and it's essentially where threat actors, or sorry, pen testers, white hat hackers, they can try to hack Google or Facebook, and if they manage to do that, they can get paid. I know two bug bounty hunters that do this for their full-time job, and they make an obscene amount of money because they're so good at finding bugs. But with Google and Facebook, it's a lot harder to find them because they are so secure. So this is very, very technical. It does require you to be at the tip top of your cybersecurity skills, but it is something that you all can look at if you're interested. That is a form of risk reduction when you're taking proactive steps to find out what vulnerabilities exist on your tech stack. Now, why is this important? Why do a lot of organizations need to be aware of this? Well, because when you're looking at risk, you need to be able to categorize it accordingly so that you know what are the ones that are most impactful and one of the most likelihood. And then you will use a kind of like one of these strategies to address it. The thing is, not one of these, you don't have to use one strategy for one risk, another strategy for one risk. You can actually use a combined strategy, kind of like a hybrid approach. And that's all going to depend on what the risk is. I would say it depends on what the risk is, what the tech stack is associated with it, if it's people, and then it's also its severity, whether it has a high severity rate, whether it's like high likelihood and high impact or not. The most important thing that you can do, however, when it comes to risk mitigation is make sure that it is ongoing. It's not just a one and done. You want to keep doing it so that you have regular updates, so that you're able to adapt to new emerging technology or emerging threats. There is a constant monitoring and flow of that entire process. Okay? So let's kind of dig into the first one, which is acceptance. Now, acceptance is recognizing that the risk exists and consciously choosing not to mitigate it, consciously choosing not to take action on this. Why is this important? Because with this strategy, it's when the cost or the effort associated with mitigating this risk outweighs the benefit. It outweighs the potential impact of that risk. Again, this is you typically accept risks that are low likelihood and low impact. So you don't want to spend all of your really expensive cybersecurity resources, time, and energy to address those when they could be addressing more high priority items. Now, if you remember, risk tolerance is essentially where you are saying, hey, how much risk are we willing to accept as a company? When you're talking about that, things that come into mind is you want to look at the company's current performance, whether it's performing well or not. You want to look at if there was any past cybersecurity incidences that would impact it. You want to look at business goals and growth strategy. Are the risks associated with business goals and strategy going to impact you? So organizations that have a higher risk tolerance means that they may accept more risks. That means that if you're an organization that's very strong technically, that you have a really strong tech stack, that you haven't had very many cybersecurity incidences, well, then you pretty have a higher risk tolerance because then you can say, hey, I think we're pretty okay. We have a lot of secure steps here. We have a lot of secure items. We're good here. Right. Now, this is really important because you want to make sure that you're setting clear criteria for how to accept risks. That means you're looking at the impact of the risk. You're looking at the probability of the risk. You're looking at the potential consequences of the risk. All of these are going to play a part into your risk tolerance so that you understand how important it is. I don't know if you remember, but there was one point where I was supposed to teach, but I was unable to because I was in Thailand at the time and we had an earthquake. In this case, we never had an earthquake in Bangkok before. And so when that happened, we weren't fully prepared because we had a high risk tolerance for that specific risk. We mitigated it, but it was unprecedented, I guess you could say. Then you have to go into impact analysis. So the impact analysis is when companies have limited resources, so you have to prioritize what risks, you have to prioritize the risk responses. Essentially, you have to, before choosing to accept the risk, you have to discuss the extent of impact. You have to discuss the extent of personal or potential harm. When you have that discussion and when you better understand what the potential harm is, then you can go ahead and evaluate how it'll affect different people in the organizations, not just internally, but you have to look at how is it going to affect customers? How is it going to affect our external reputation outside of the organization? If we accept this risk, does that put us at any legal issues? Does that put us at any compliance or regulatory issues? What exactly is the major impact here, and how much would it cost for us to recover it? What is the time, effort, and cost it would take for us to um, to recover? That's where cost benefit comes into mind, because cost benefit is essentially comparing the cost of the actual mitigation itself. So how much it would cost to have resources, technology, or to move things, to then looking at the potential losses if the risk materializes. So if you were to say, hey, we're T app, we're this application, and a risk is we have a data server that is unsecure, but we don't want to secure it because we think that would take too much time, money, it would be too complicated. We don't want to deal with that. We want to focus on things that make us money, which is this membership. Well, um, now it's inversed, where they see, oh, that's a huge risk, and we shouldn't have accepted it. We should have mitigated it and avoided it completely. Because when you don't look at it properly, when you don't do the proper cost benefit analysis, you could experience reputational harm, which they're experiencing, financial damage, they're getting sued out the wazoo, and then you could definitely experience business disruption. They are not very reliable now. I can guarantee you that no one is really wanting to download that application anymore because they don't trust it. So that reputation and that business disruption is costing them heavily. And the last one is data loss. Data loss that the T app found is tremendous. They've put out phone numbers, they've put out very private data, they put out private chats that users thought were secure. And essentially, these are all the elements you want to look into if you're going to accept that a risk is going to be accepted. If mitigation costs are more than the expected loss, acceptance may be justified. However, when we're talking about acceptance, it's very important to understand that acceptance is not denial. Acceptance is not ignoring the issue or hiding your face in the sand. It is essentially not saying, an example, denial is when you know your bank account balance is low, but you're spending anyways and not paying attention to it. That is denial. That is not what risk acceptance is. Risk acceptance is a deliberate and informed decision to tolerate a risk. You're making that decision actively. You're not just saying, oh, it's there, it exists. You're saying, hey, we're aware it exists, we see it, and we're choosing we're not going to take any specific action on it. Now, it's not about certainty. Okay. It's not about certainty. Risk does not mean that it's being 100% confident in predictions or outcomes. We're not saying that this is the future. We're not trying to predict the future here. Even if you have a detailed analysis, we still have to accept that the future is outside of our control and we don't know what exactly would happen, because a lot of things can happen. Natural disasters, technology changes, technology evolves. There are new threats that come about. All of these are different elements that we don't have control over, so we don't have we can't kind of predict it per se. And then there's risk elimination. So risk elimination means that we're accepting that a risk does not accepting a risk means that we're not removing it. Does not mean we're removing it. The risk still exists and we're acknowledging it exists, but the organization simply decides that we're not going to take any preventative action against it. There's no essential need to, in essence, right? And then there's not permanent. What does not permanent mean? Not permanent means that when you accept a risk, you're not saying, hey, we're never going to fix it. We're not going to say, it's not a fixed solution. Maybe you're accepting the risk in this quarter. Maybe you're accepting the risk in this year. An example is with CMMC. So if you remember, there's a compliance standard called CMMC, which is essentially the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. And in that model, you give a certain risk or a certain control a score of 0 to 5. 0 meaning you don't have that control at all. 5 meaning you have that control and it's very mature. In this case, you can have situations where you don't have a control at all, and that control would be 0. So you're accepting that you don't have this control. But because of your business initiatives and what you're wanting to do in the future, you're okay with that because you're focusing on higher priority controls. That is a form of acceptance, meaning it's not permanent solution. It could be that the next quarter, that's going to turn into a 3 because you're in the process of purchasing a solution to bring that control to a 3. A very simple example is access control. If you have, well, you're going to have some form of access control, so we'll give you a 1. And then in 2026, we say, okay, we're accepting a 1 for now. It's not permanent, but in 2027, it's going to become a 4 because we're buying a solution that streamlines and centralizes all access control. So that's an example of how acceptance is not permanent. If the environment changes, if the technology changes, well, then such as a more costly incident occurs, or threat actors become more advanced for that specific one, or maybe there's some technology changes. All of these are elements that could make the organization revisit whether accepting that risk is the right choice or not. Now, an organization at any point in time, they can revisit that and change their strategy. They can reassess whether they want to do that specific do that specific do that specific acceptance criteria or not. So why I bring this up and why this is so important for us to understand acceptance is because it is not just saying, hey, this risk exists and we're accepting it. That's not what we're saying. We're saying this risk exists, we see it, we know it exists, and for now, we're okay with it because we have other priorities. The concept of risk acceptance should always be tied to priority and what we want to focus our time, energy, and money on first, because that focus enables us to respond quicker, enables us to actually take care of the risks that are going to have a bigger impact on us as an organization, as opposed to a risk that is lower on the totem pole, per se. Okay? And again, it is not just hiding your head in the sand. It is not just ignoring it, but it is acknowledging it exists. It's not a permanent solution. We can always revisit it, and it's accepting that we don't know the future. That means that at any point in time, things can change. So that acceptance could change to avoidance, could change to deterrence at any point in time. All right. Okay, we're at the top of the hour, so I will let Gracia go ahead and give us the ducks. Here is the duck timer thread. Alrighty. Let's all just jump back in. Okay, so let's start by doing some. Let me make sure I have. Okay. So let's start by doing a little scenario. Okay. So in this scenario, we're Let's Go, and we have a software development team that is trying to launch a new website feature before our competitors. So this is very common in the travel industry. We're trying to release a new hot fix that's going to be really cool. Now, let's say in this situation, the leadership sets an aggressive deadline to align with the biggest travel times, which in this case is like summer vacations, right? Now, um, technical challenges and debugging delays may cause the project to miss the deadline. So we're going to take that into consideration. Before we select a risk mitigation strategy, let's first identify the risks in this scenario. So here, this is where we're going to answer our questions. Scenario thread. So A, B, or C. Which of the following is not a technical risk mentioned in the above scenario? A, B, C, A, B, or C. Everyone here mentions A. That is correct. So the concept here is not hiring engineers who work fast enough. That is not a technical risk. Now, first of all, as an organization, you shouldn't push to do things quickly without quality. You want to do things with high quality first. So that this specific one is more of a staffing and resource risk than a technical one. Question number 2. Which of the following is not a financial risk related to the above scenario? Which of the ones is a financial risk related to the above scenario? All right, everyone says C. That is correct. So it would be having to pay to renew our domain name. That's not a financial risk. However, potentially missing profits, that is one. And then longer development time could be higher costs for the actual developers themselves. That is awesome. Now, let's talk a little bit about risk tolerance. Now, remember, we are talking about our fictional company here, which is Let's Go. So it is a startup, and we have a very high risk tolerance, meaning that our risk tolerance is really high. We're accepting a bunch of different risks. Now, the team is willing to take calculated risk in order to remain competitive, right? So remember, we're going into impact analysis. For the risks identified earlier, let's try to estimate if the risk is high impact and high likelihood or neither. So, is missing the deadline due to a technical challenge a high likelihood, a high impact, high likelihood, or neither? Based off the information we were given. All right, I've seen a lot of people say high likelihood. That is correct. Because remember, this sentence gave it away, saying unforeseen technical challenges, multiple debugging could cause the project to miss the deadline. So with that information, we know that it is a high likelihood, which is why it would be B. Question number 4, assuming that the initial deadline is at the end of January, is the risk of missing the summer vacation planning window considered high impact, high likelihood, or neither? A lot of people are picking A. So that is correct. Because we're looking at it's at the end of January, the deadline is the end of January, that means that it'll be good to go before the summer. So is missing the summer window high impact? It is high impact. Now, let's look a little bit at cost benefit analysis. In this case, the challenges are that unpredictable the challenges are essentially unpredictability and time consuming. So these technical glitches could be a major red flag. Now, the solutions need us to do additional research, some redesign, extra testing. That would mean that there would need to take additional cost. So those additional costs may exceed the actual benefit of that new website feature. Now, early release. Now, if we release this feature that's very buggy, well, then it may save time up front. It may be like, hey, we're able to actually release this and maybe we'll make some money. However, if we release it early, it could cause issues because some customers might say, hey, I don't like this feature. It's not working for me. It's being buggy. So customer dissatisfaction will go up. Maybe there's increased long-term maintenance costs because we're always going to have to do some small fixes and tweaks, or it could potentially damage our brand because then they'll say, hey, it's a very clunky feature. It doesn't even work as well. And maybe our competitor took the time and effort to release it later that's higher quality, and they'll go to them instead of Let's Go. So based off of all of this, when it comes to the decision, we have to consider that the team should not accept the risk of releasing early because, in our mind, the financial impact of customer dissatisfaction, higher maintenance costs, and then brand reputation exceeds is a bit too much for us to just say, hey, we accept it. Instead, we should delay the launch to make sure that we're producing a quality product or a quality feature on the website, that we're making sure that it's reaching the highest QA standards, and that we're managing the right expectations internally and externally so that we say the feature is actually going to do what we promised it would do. This delaying of a feature is actually really common in cybersecurity and in all tech companies, because then they'll say, hey, we're delaying the launch of this because we want to make sure that it's working as well as possible. That is far better than releasing a buggy system. Here's an example. If you are using if you're gonna go watch a movie, do you want to watch a movie that's been fully vetted, fully produced, and everything, or do you want to watch a movie that's potentially half-baked? That's the entire concept here. So the decision is to delay it so that we can build something that has quality. Next, the other strategy we want to talk about is avoidance. So avoidance means that you're eliminating the possibility of that risk entirely by either not engaging it, not using it, or making a decision completely against it. So the idea behind this strategy is it's entirely proactive. It's used if you think that the risk is too severe or unacceptable to tolerate, meaning that it is completely impossible for us to operate with that risk. A common one would be, hey, we're using a third party, and the third party is storing all of our data unencrypted in plain text. Well, that's completely unacceptable, because if we are giving you our client data and you breach our client data, that data came from us. So that's not good. That puts us in a really bad situation. So, what are the things you need to do in order to put this strategy in place? Well, the first one is you need to identify risks that are completely unacceptable and that are highly threatening to your business. That means they're high likelihood and high impact, both of those. And then you want to analyze the risks so that it can be completely avoided through maybe operational strategies, maybe process challenge strategies, technical strategies. You're trying to find something to change in order to not have that risk be present at all. Now, once you've identified that risk and once you know that you can get rid of it, well, then you can start looking at developing alternatives. When we're talking about developing alternatives, we're talking about brainstorming maybe other methods to accomplish that specific business activity, or maybe there are other tools that you can use, or maybe there's another way you can accomplish the objective without triggering that risk. Maybe that risk isn't an actual tool or a server. Maybe that risk is a part of a tool. So maybe it has to go through this one server, through this one network in order to complete its objective. Could you do an alternate route? Then you want to evaluate how effective and realistic the alternative is. This is where brainstorming comes in, where you really think through, okay, what is the best way for us to essentially still accomplish our goal, but not introduce or reintroduce this risk. Once you're able to come up with some ideas, that's when you go through a cost benefit analysis. So this is where you confirm the alternative is less risky and not more expensive. Keep in mind, cybersecurity always keeps dollar amounts in mind. We're thinking, is this going to be too expensive to implement? Is it doable? What are the strategies that are going to be able to mitigate this risk as well as lower the cost? Big bonus points if you're able to mitigate the risk and really lower the cost of it, meaning you're not adding any additional costs. Congratulations to Duane, duck number 51. And then all right. Then, once we're talking about avoidance, you have to talk with your partners and stakeholders. Why do you need to do this? Well, this is all about having clarity and transparency. You want to share your decision to avoid the risk with internal and external stakeholders that they're aware. This makes sure that everyone understands the change, understands that there's been a change in the project scope or project direction. So everyone is just aware. The entire concept here is awareness and communication. You want to over communicate more than you want to under communicate because the risk can only be avoided if all contributors, partners, team members, and everyone involved adjust to the plan accordingly. If there are some teams that are left out of the loop, maybe they might try to still use the system, but if it comes offline, then they aren't able to use it anymore, and that could cause an issue for them. When you keep people informed, they can make better and more informed decisions. Mustafa, good to know. Next time you can put in five numbers. Just kidding, don't do that. That would make it a bit too crazy. All right. Okay. Now let's go into a scenario about avoidance. Well, in this scenario, we're going to talk about facial recognition. Now, as you can imagine, facial recognition is kind of a hot topic right now because a lot of people care more about their privacy. They don't like the idea that their facial structure is being stored in a server somewhere because they're afraid that tech people are going to misuse it. Maybe there are some privacy violations, or maybe some other tech companies are essentially going to use facial recognition for any sort of nefarious purposes. I'll tell you all one privacy reason. One of the privacy reason is due to deepfakes. Now, deepfakes is when you're able to put someone's face, anyone's face, onto another person's body and then make them do compromising things. They can be things as silly as putting someone's face and then them doing a silly dance, or it could be more serious things, like them putting their face on someone else and that person is doing a crime. Believe it or not, that is being used today. I can say that with very big confidence. And so that's why a lot of people are worried about facial recognition. Amazon developed a facial recognition tool for police surveillance. Now, there is another company that you might have heard of before. They're called Clear. So Clear is a company Clear is a company at an airport which essentially does private travel that's pushing for facial recognition scans for all travelers before flight, because then it simplifies this and everything and all that. So they're really, really big proponents of that. Now, the industry here, it's now getting really, really big. People are really starting to really enjoy it. Microsoft is getting into the game. They faced a key decision. So protect its reputation by avoiding facial recognition, or pursue profit and innovation by selling the actual technology. Now, there's a lot of pressure that came from the need to like keep talented engineers engaged with exciting and impactful projects such as facial recognition. And so they're seeing a really, really big value where it's starting to climb more and more and more and more. So with all this information, here is the responses. Do one eye. Do one eye. Thank you, Brian. Do one eye. So A, B, or C. Which of the following is not a business risk mentioned in this scenario? Which of the following is not a business risk mentioned in this scenario? In the thread? Oh, a lot of people saying A. All right. No, it would not be A. In this case, it would be C. So I get why you would pick A, but in this case, it's not a business risk because it's not having enough profit sales from other areas of the company to remain profitable. So it would be C. Number two, which of the following is not a regulatory risk faced by Microsoft in this scenario? A, B, or C? Remember, this is a multiple choice one. Okay. I see a lot of people saying B. It would be all three, actually. Which of the following is not a regulatory risk? So none of these would be regulatory risks in this case. All right. Risk tolerance levels. When it comes to risk tolerance levels, so we're saying that Microsoft has a low risk tolerance because have uh, they have really high public visibility. A lot of people know Microsoft, and a lot of people are aware that Microsoft is a big company, and so they have eyes on them when it comes to what they're trying to do. So they have a really low risk tolerance to that. They have a really low risk tolerance because they have a really good reputation. They're known as having the most computers in the entire world, so they want to stand for what's right. And then they have government and military partnerships. Microsoft is used all over the world. And so they need to make sure that they're operating at the highest security level. So that's why they have a really low risk tolerance. A privacy related incident could really harm Microsoft. It could plummet their stock prices. It could impact their future partnerships, especially in the military and in the government space. And then their entire global perception could be impacted. Is clear the airport identity service the same service used to authenticate LinkedIn accounts? I'm not sure, Richard. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. I do remember them being somewhat associated with them in the past, maybe. So when it comes to developing alternatives, Microsoft explored some revenue, ethical, and talent retention alternatives to selling facial recognition. So instead, they're looking at other alternatives. So here we go for thread responses 2. For each of the risks identified earlier, let's determine a potential alternative. Which of the following strategies could help offset profit loss resulting from not selling facial recognition software? A, B, or C? I see answers coming in. That is correct. It's redirecting your marketing efforts to promote other products. When you do that, well, then you're making up for any potential financial loss. Question number 2. Which of the following is a feasible approach for protecting citizens' rights to privacy while still selling facial recognition software? A, B, or C? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of people saying B or C. We're going to go with B. So the reason why B is the correct answer is specifically because you want to only sell to individuals and avoiding sales to law enforcement and other government agencies because protecting your citizens' privacy. Because when you're selling just to those, well, then you're not essentially exposing it to more people than you can. Now, selling only to vetted organizations with strict privacy, that is also an option. But in this case, selling to the actual individual would limit the amount of data exposure. And then 3, which of the following is feasible alternative to selling facial recognition software that keeps senior data scientists at the company engaged in meaningful work? A, B, or C? That is correct. It's developing products like Windows Hello, using facial recognition for strict control over flow and use of data to maintain customer privacy. That is awesome. Great job, everyone. So, what did Microsoft do in this instant? Well, Microsoft had to notify their PC manufacturers like Dell and Lenovo that they're implementing that they're not that they're going to do or not do this. They had to reach out to their sales and marketing teams, and they had to reach out to their retail partners like Best Buy. The idea here is transparency. They're trying to align with their strategy and make sure to set the expectations by shifting away from facial recognition for privacy reasons, which is a really good thing. So in the end, Microsoft chose to avoid selling facial recognition software to law enforcement until there are better laws in place to do that, which I think is a phenomenal decision by Microsoft. Why this is important? Because it helps protect the company's reputation because they have a lot of visibility. It aligns with their low risk tolerance that we had talked about before, and it preserves the option to re-enter the market when there is more regulation. Remember, all of these strategies aren't permanent. They can shift and change as needed. Speaking of shifting and changing, the other strategy we want to talk about is transfer. Now, when you're transferring a risk, you're essentially you're essentially shifting the financial consequences or responsibility of the risk to another party. So, this is essentially used when the potential risk is too large for the organization to bear alone, meaning you need to share the load, or it's more cost effective to let a third party manage the risk entirely as opposed to yourself. The easiest way to understand where transfer strategy comes into play is actually in insurance. Because if you have a car, you have insurance. When you have insurance, you're transferring the risk of an accident to the insurance. Sure, you're paying a monthly fee so that they actually that's what you pay for transferring that risk. However, if something were to occur, the insurance company would be the ones taking the brunt end of it. So, when it comes to insurance policies, there are a lot of organizations that buy insurance to cover specific risks. A lot of them include insurance such as property damage, maybe business interruption. There's also cybersecurity insurance for cybersecurity incidences like a data breach or a ransomware attack. This is actually very common, and a lot of companies are pretty data first. So, if a company is, for example, facing a ransomware attack, well, then their insurance could potentially cover the cost of malware cleanup, the cost to hire a third party to go ahead and take care of the ransomware. They'll cover the cost to restore the systems back online. And if there are any law or regulatory fines that come in, whether it's legal or settlement costs, well, then the insurance companies could then take that on as well. Now, it's important to note that you always want to check what's actually covered in those policies because some insurance companies will say, hey, you cover this, but not this. Right. So you want to make sure that you exclude key threats such as like nascent they may exclude things like a nation state cyber attack or maybe like a really big hacktivist attack or what have you. They they also require you to have high deductibles, meaning a deductible is how much you pay before the insurance covers it. So if the bill is $100 and your deductible is 20, you pay $20 and then the insurance covers the rest. That's what deductible is. And then there might be a limit of coverage amount. Maybe they only cover up to $80 and the rest of the 20 you have to take care of. So the understanding here is overall just insurance. Another way to transfer it is through a contract. So when you do a risk transfer via contract, you can have it in writing into a vendor, a partner, or a supplier or a contractor. These contracts can have specific responsibilities and liabilities to different parties based on who has the better equipment to manage the risk, who is in a better situation financially. Maybe there's operational expertise or some team members that are able to mitigate the risk better or control it over a certain area, such as the IT and risk, that kind of stuff. An example would be like, say, if you're a cloud provider, you have a contract that may require the vendor to handle service outages or to cover losses from the data center failures. Those are examples of transference. And then there's something that we call an indemnation clause. Now, an indemnation clause is essentially a clause in a contract or in a document that essentially specifies which party pays for what case, for what, in case of any legal issues or any specific sort of loss. Now, this is very common in contracts because they either protect one party or both parties so that from the consequences if another party makes an offense or has a specific action. Take your mind back to when we're talking about third parties. Those third parties are essentially those third parties could essentially take any action, and if you don't have an indemnification clause and you could not be protected. So if a software provider agrees to cover legal costs if their tool causes a client's data breach, that's an example of an indemnification clause. They're saying, hey, we'll cover the costs if our tool is the cause of a data breach. Okay? Now, there are additional options. There are additional ways to do the risk transfer. The most common ones are insurance and contracts, but there's also something called performance bonds and guarantees. This is essentially where a service provider or a contractor can be required to provide a certain level of service or a certain guarantee. That means that this serves as like a financial safety net if the vendor fails to meet that specific obligation. This can also be called an SLA, a service level agreement. What this does is this shifts the risk of non-performance away from the organization and puts it in the hands of the vendor or the contractor. Another one is outsourcing or subcontracting. So, outsourcing is when you're transferring the operational risk. So, the things that are keeping it operating, you're outsourcing that task to third-party experts, right? So, this could be like when you're outsourcing, you're essentially agreeing on things like clear expectations of what needs to be done, what performance needs to happen. You have accountability clauses. Outsourcing could be something like, hey, we're an organization, we're a tech first company, but we don't have an actual security operations center. So we're going to outsource it to a third party cybersecurity team. Now, when you outsource it, you have to say, okay, we want updates every day, we want a report every week, we want to be alerted immediately if there's some behavior that's the performance we're looking for, and we want to monitor all of your end stations to make sure that you're actually doing your job. That keeps clear expectations, performance standards, as well as accountability. Now, sometimes you'll have subcontracting within that. Now, a subcontracting is another way of risk transference where you're delegating the risk to certain specifics, specialists, to certain people, and then you're giving that risk to focused expertise in a very complex area. An example is very deep operations, and you're subcontracting to one specific person. This is sometimes a contract that comes in. That's what I did when it came to red teaming. I was subcontracted by a contracting company that was under a contracting company to provide that service. So that is a way of transference. Then there's joint ventures and alliances. What does this mean? This is essentially when you're creating a strategic alliance that allows for risk sharing, meaning two or more people or two or more organizations are partnering together. What this does is it pools resources together and it spreads the liability across multiple different organizations. For example, there's something called an LLC, which stands for a limited liability company, where it provides things such as asset protection. It protects you in case you get sued. It provides legal separation of the actual person and the business risk. And then it simplifies tax and ownership structures for small teams. This is a really great way to join organizations and put them under one roof to protect them from liability. In case a risk were to materialize, well, then you wouldn't be fully at fault. You would kind of like spread it out across different people. Let me check the thread. No one's asleep. Great. All right. Um, for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and skip the transfer scenario for now, but we will do the other scenario. All right, reduction. So When it comes to reduction, so when it comes to reduction, sorry, one second, okay. When it comes to reduction, the idea here is obviously to reduce or minimize the likelihood and impact of risk rather than eliminating or transferring the risk. Now, remember, we said that risk reduction and acceptance are similar. The only difference is that acceptance, we do nothing. Reduction, we're actually minimizing or taking small steps to lower that. So, unlike avoidance or acceptance, this strategy involves a lot of proactive measures. You're taking proactive steps to strengthen the resilience and reduce harm. The concept of resilience here is saying how strong, how able are you to withstand or weather a storm if something were to occur? So, what are the ways you can do reduction? Essentially, this strategy is all around different changes you can do to improve it. One of the ones you can do is a technical one. Now, we've talked about this in the past. Technical controls that you can put in place is having antivirus on your computer, making sure you have firewalls, making sure you're doing network segmentation, making sure you have an IDS or an IPS, something like intrusion prevention or intrusion detection system, and then making sure you're adding some redundancy or backups for your critical systems. A reminder, your critical systems are the systems you don't want to fail because it would have the biggest impact on your business if they were to go down. So making sure that you have those redundancies and those backups. Making sure that you're setting up regular maintenance and inspection on your equipment or on your items to make sure that they're functioning properly, same as with software. And then you want to do routine security audits. Routine security audits means that you're looking to make sure that all of your patches, all of your software updates are going well, that your configurations are following best practices, and that there's no unauthorized access. So you're doing a lot of access control reviews. An example of a way to do this is to do like security audits or a pen test on a quarterly basis just to find out what vulnerabilities exist on your system or your network. There are operational changes that you can do in the reduction strategy. This means that you can essentially look at how your business is operating from a workflow perspective, find out any places that can be improved, any places that are inefficient, any places that are exposing risk. Exposing risk unintentionally. So you can introduce something called quality control checkpoints to see if there are any mistakes. If you're working at a factory, people are producing things, well, then you can do a quality checkpoint to see if there are any mistakes. You can enhance any response speed during incidences, or you can create an escalation protocol so that frontline staff workers know exactly who to communicate to when if something goes wrong. So again, the concept of who do I reach out to? Who do I talk to? That's an important point. Then the last one is training and skill development. So this means that you're providing a lot of training, a lot of resources, a lot of cybersecurity awareness to all your staff. So they understand that they, the humans, the resources, are the first firewall. They're the first line of defense. This ensures that employees understand that their role in risk mitigation is incredibly important because they can do things such as MFA, making sure they're using really good passwords, making sure they know what a phishing email is, making sure they know what social engineering is and how to prevent it, making sure they know how to protect their privacy and their data and not put their social security number on their work computer. All of these are skills that can be taught and trained to employees because employees, again, constitute over 80% of the breaches that happen in cybersecurity. So it's very important that we need to be aware, we need to train them on the basics. Everybody here understands that you want to use a password manager. Everyone understands what a phishing email is, and everybody understands what um, everyone understands like what social engineering is, which means that all of you could do a cybersecurity awareness training in your organization at this point. Which, by the way, if you're interested in that, cybersecurity awareness professional, there is this very free certification that you can do. It's called the CAPC. Keep in mind, this is not like I wouldn't say this is a foolproof like accreditation. If someone sees this CAPC, they're not going to say, "Oh, wow, that's incredibly impressive." However, it is still a certification that you can add. Everyone sitting here right now could pass this if they wanted to. So, and that's a really nice thing just to add to your resume. This just means that once you pass it, you know all the basics when it comes to cybersecurity awareness, and it's completely free. I had students take it in my other class, and they all pass it really, really quickly. So that's one thing that I suggest you all do. Um, I think, yeah, we have time for this. Okay, let's go through this scenario. So the background here that we're looking at is a global toy manufacturer is increasing output for the holiday due to like the demand. So there's a lot more people wanting to buy more toys because it's been more in demand. And so there was also an increase because there was a new movie that came out, like a new blockbuster movie. So, due to the partnership with the film studio, they want to operate multiple factories in the US as well as overseas. So they have a really good bond, and so they have a high seasonal expectation. That being said, answer thread. Which of the following is not an operational risk faced by the toy manufacturer? I will go ahead and pin this. A, B, or C? Which of the following is not an operational risk faced by the toy manufacturer? That is correct. We're hopping into fantasy land. So Santa's elves is not an operational risk because that is fiction. It would not truly happen. Question number 2. Which of the following is a financial risk for the toy manufacturer? A, B, or C? Multiple choice. Okay, I see people saying all. All right, I'm gonna go with the first answer there. That is correct. All of them are financial risks. The film studio taking a large percent of the toy profits for royalties and licensing. That would be a financial risk. A lower profit margin for toys manufactured abroad due to multiple chain costs. Yep. And a lower profit margin due to physical toy production compared to video game production. That is true. Risk tolerance level. So the company essentially has been in business for over 50 years, and they have a lot of experience and they have a lot of resilience. However, there's been a decline of major toy resellers, but there's been a rise in digital entertainment. So, um, safety regulations are still a present risk, and particularly if standards are not met. That's what we're saying here. So in essence, their risk tolerance is at a medium, given all this information. So reduction method. Question number 3. How can the toy manufacturer reduce the risk of manufacturing machines in their factories? A, B, or C? All right, everyone is saying A. That is correct. They implement a lot of preventive maintenance schedules for all machines. That means that they're making sure that the machines are functioning to their top potential. Question number 4. How can the toy manufacturer reduce the financial risk identified previously? A, B, or C, multiple choice. we got multiple answers. A for sure. Side says all. A and B. All right, we'll just do all because it looks like there's a huge range. So it is A and B. So how can a tariff reduce the financial risk? It can raise prices on all goods and account for additional shipping, producing an online companion game for their toys, and then not attempting to renew the contract with the film studio to hope for another hit movie. The hope for another hit movie, that isn't a great financial strategy. So, in the end, the toy manufacturer proactively implements technical and operational risk reduction strategies. So, they're taking the technical approach as well as operational ones, and they're minimizing the downtime and production issues by doing this. They're also reducing the financial exposure, and then they're improving their product value through the digital engagement. So, because of all of this, they're better prepared to meet the demand without sacrificing the quality or the profitability. All right. So we talked about all four of these. And now let's kind of shift a little bit and talk about adjusting after risk incidences. This is important because remember, after an incident, the immediate thing you should do is a lesson learned. Additionally, you should check your entire organizations for any other type of vulnerabilities. So, this step is crucial and not one to be missed. When an incident occurs, it's not just that you had an incident and you don't just look at the bad. You also have to look at it as a potential learning opportunity. When you're looking at risk management and risk mitigation, it's not just about the prevention, it's also about how well you responded to that incident and how you can adapt to future incidents in the future. The idea here is you want to make sure that it you want to try and make sure that the way an incident happens doesn't happen twice. You want it to only happen once if it is to happen, and then you make sure to seal that weakness and that vulnerability off to make sure to avoid that risk entirely if you can. So, after a risk incident, it's important to do first an immediate response. What does that mean? That means you're following the incident response steps, you're containing the incident so that it doesn't spread, it doesn't create more damage, so you're minimizing the impact. You're communicating clearly to your stakeholders. That means your incident response team, making sure that all your internal teams are aware of what's happening, all your external partners are aware, maybe any of your vendors that are connected to that specific risk, any of the regulators that you have. And if you're traded on the stock market, now you're required to disclose an incident if there's specifically a data breach that affects customers within 3 days. So your customers should be notified as well. So incident, you have to immediately respond to the incident. Then you have to do an incident analysis. That means you do a root cause analysis to understand exactly what happened. You want to pinpoint why the incident took place in the beginning. And then you want to do an impact assessment so that you can understand an overall impact of it. That means understanding, well, what was the financial impact? Were there losses? Were there fines? Did we have to pay some recovery costs? What are the operational impacts? What was the downtime? How were customers not able to use our product? What was the workflow disruption? What is the reputational impact? Have we lost customer trust? Is our brand image down? Here's a question. With the T app, with the T app, how do you think their if you were to do an impact assessment, how would you assess the impact, the overall impact? So, in your own words, in that thread, with what happened to the T app, specifically with that second breach, what do you think is the financial impact? What do you think is the operational impact? What do you think is the reputational impact and then regulatory impact? Because there are a lot. If anything, even add your opinion of what you think is the biggest impact to this company because they didn't follow all the right procedures in order to protect their organization. Bankruptcy, Karina says. If any of you are ever on TikTok, I highly suggest you look up the T app. I think there was someone who used to work there that said some very interesting things about the organization overall, especially from an impact assessment, given what happened. Potential bankruptcy, millions in lawsuits. That is correct, Brendan. That is exactly what this website is saying. They're saying that there are a lot of women who are suing. T is having to pay millions of dollars to damages to plaintiffs. Did not protect human life. Peter, you're absolutely correct. They leaked personal information, phone numbers, very personal details that could lead to identity theft. So a lot of these women are at risk of having their lives heavily impacted and potentially harmed. Uh, Business closing, not like it could happen. We'll see. There's been a huge reputational damage for sure. Deep identity theft, data leak, loss of confidence to customers. That's correct. There are so many women now that say, "Oh, I don't want to put my information or my data in that app anymore because they don't have the right cybersecurity best practices." A second hack after a couple days is not good. Yes, Richard, they're paying so much in legal fees right now. Those are all accurate. Well done. Well done. So this is all in the incident analysis and root cause analysis. So we're trying to find out what exactly happened as well as the impact. So this is the impact we would be looking into. After the incident, there's also something where we call review existing risk mitigation strategies. Excuse me. That means you look at your overall risk mitigation strategies, whether you're looking to avoid, transfer, or reduce. You're looking at all the risks that you have, and you're asking these questions. You're asking what exactly worked well? What is still working well? What is not working well? What can we improve? Where have we objectively failed? And then where are the gaps? Using a gap analysis actually would work in this situation. You look at what we have right now versus what we would like. Is there an optimal risk mitigation strategy that we want? Ideally, the best mitigation step is to avoid it completely. However, there are some operational or business reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. Once you identify whether the existing approach is the best approach, well, then you can go ahead and shift or change as needed, because then you can either make it better or you can change it so that that risk is lower priority. So you put all those resources, time, and money towards another risk strategy. And then there is adjust risk mitigation strategies overall. What does this mean? That means that you're looking at your overall risk. You're looking at all your risks you have. You're re-evaluating those risks, maybe looking at their severity score, maybe looking at what is the high likelihood or high impact. An example would be if I were the T app, I would re-evaluate my risk and say, okay, one of our risks that had a high likelihood and high impact was that our data servers were not encrypted and they did not have the right security controls, which means that there's a very high likelihood and high impact that all of our other data servers, maybe that are storing money or storing like personal information or whatnot, are also bad. So you want to reevaluate those risks, and then that's when you give them a different score, maybe fed by everything else that you've seen in the incident. Some may have been underestimated or missed entirely. So when you reevaluate those risks, your risk registrar will be more up to date. Then you look at all of your strategies, whether you're accepting, avoiding, transferring, or reducing, and you're using your information that you collected after the incident to make decisions. So this is where you take the lessons learned. You take new data. Maybe there's a new CVE that came out about your specific organization or your network. And then you can go ahead and make decisions on how you approach it. So that may mean that you either strengthen the controls you have in place, or you implement some new policies to address it, or you retire any outdated approaches. All of these are appropriate responses to any risks that happen. I would say that overall, when you're looking at risk management and risk mitigation, it is not something that happens once. It is living, it is breathing, it evolves. It is something that you want to revisit multiple times, because each incident essentially brings a new strategy closer to a really high level of resilience. All right, let's go ahead and do a quiz. Quiz thread. All right, I think this is just a 4-question quiz. So, question number 1. A, B, or C. If the risk cannot be mitigated without compromising a primary business goal, which strategy should you choose? We're getting a lot of things for B. That is correct. So if you can't mitigate without compromising a really big business goal, well, then you should avoid it. Question number 2. If the cost of reducing the risk is more than the cost of dealing with the consequence of the risk, which strategy should you select? A, B, C, or D? That is correct. You want to accept it. Remember, when you accept a risk, you're not saying, oh, we're just leaving it, forgetting it, we're not thinking about it. You're deliberately making a decision to accept it. Because when you accept it, you're essentially saying, all right, that is a low likelihood and a low impact. So that's where we accept it. Question number 3. If the risk is unavoidable, but the impact can be minimized with proper planning and operational changes, which strategy should you choose? A, B, C, or D? Everyone says D. That is correct. In this case, it is reduction. If the risk is unavoidable, but the impact can be minimized with proper planning and operational changes, which strategy should you choose? Reduction. Question number 4. If you cannot reduce the impact of the risk, but a more resilient or specialized partner can absorb the impact better, which strategy should you choose? A, B, C, or D? That one's pretty straightforward. It is C. That is called transference. Now, hopefully in this lesson, you have a pretty clear understanding of risk mitigation and why risk mitigation matters. Because it's not just about understanding that risk mitigation is centered around proactive work. It's not just focused on how to assess and prioritize the risk. It's not just focused on the concept of either accepting, avoiding, transferring, or reducing the risk. Around it's also around the overall understanding that all of this is proactive. When you take all these proactive steps, you're reducing the likelihood and the impact of a risk needing to take place. I really want to emphasize this. When you get into the professional world, understand that after a risk happens, in order to prevent what happened here, you want to take the steps, you want to take the appropriate risk mitigation steps and incident response steps. Anytime you're at a new organization and an incident happens, I'm empowering everyone sitting in this classroom right now to say, hey, this incident happens. Do we need to look at any of our other vulnerabilities? Do we need to look at any other systems? Are there any other servers that we need to protect? I'm giving you all the freedom to do that now, because you can use this as an example. You say the T app was hacked because they had one of their servers unsecured. And then they got hacked again because they did not protect or do a vulnerability scan of all their other servers. And so use this in an interview. If someone says, what are the steps in an incident response process? Well, then you go through all of them. And then at the end, when you say lessons learned, you also say, we want to scan all of our other systems to make sure that we're covering all around. Okay.